Welcome to Stories Junction. Let's begin today's story. My name is James, I'm 29, and I'm single. That hasn't always been true, though. A few months ago, I was in a relationship that sapped my energy more than it brought me calm. At first, it seemed like any other romance. Petty arguments, nothing out of the ordinary. But as time went on, I noticed a pattern that started to unravel me. Whenever we disagreed, she'd shut me out, sometimes for days. It was her way of control, her silent punishment. If I tried to voice my feelings or point out how her approach hurt, she'd turn it back on me, making me question myself. That kind of emotional tug-of-war wears you down. I'd end up apologizing just to smooth things over, even when I wasn't wrong. Eventually, her subtle manipulations turned into outright disrespect, cutting remarks that left me raw. I was always on guard, wondering what I'd done this time. So, I made the call to end it. It wasn't simple, but I walked away. Since then, I've poured everything into work. I took on extra projects, traveled for assignments, stayed late, and said yes to impossible deadlines. If I wasn't going to give my heart to someone who didn't value it, I'd invest in something that might pay off, like a promotion. One Wednesday afternoon, my phone buzzed. It was my sister, Claire, calling from Chicago. She's a year older, and since she got married and moved there, our talks have been less frequent, but still warm. We usually catch up, trade stories, and poke fun at old family memories. This time, though, it had been nearly 2 weeks since we last spoke. I picked up, and after our usual hellos and quick updates, I could tell something was off in her voice. This wasn't just a check-in. "I need a favor," she said, cutting to the point. I told her to spill it, already curious. She explained that her friend was moving into a new apartment and could use a hand. My first instinct was to push back. I work long hours, and weekends are my only chance to catch my breath or run errands. Can't she hire movers? I asked. Claire's tone softened as she explained that her friend had just gone through a rough divorce and didn't have the money for professional help. Things were tight for her. That made me pause. I asked who the friend was, and when Claire said Sophie, the name hit me like a forgotten song. Sophie. I hadn't thought of her in years, but I knew exactly who she was. Back when we were kids, she'd come over to our house, sometimes crashing in Claire's room for sleepovers. She was 2 years older, and to my teenage self, she was everything, kind, poised, with a quiet confidence that made my chest ache. I had a crush on her I never dared act on. Hearing her name now, out of nowhere, stirred something I thought I'd buried. Trying to keep my voice steady, I asked why her marriage ended. Claire's voice grew heavy. She said Sophie and her husband had suffered 2 miscarriages, and he'd started blaming her, as if she carried the weight of their loss alone. That hit hard. No one should endure that kind of pain, let alone be made to feel at fault. I asked when Sophie was moving. Claire said it was happening that Friday. It was Wednesday, so I told her I'd think it over and let her know by tomorrow. She thanked me and hung up. For the rest of the day, I couldn't focus. My mind kept drifting to Sophie. It's hard to describe how much I admired her back then, a quiet, burning kind of awe that lived in me for years. I remembered the sting when I heard she'd gotten married. Now, to learn she was divorced, hurting, and starting over, it stirred a mix of emotions I wasn't ready for. Part of me wanted to stay focused on work, but another part couldn't ignore the chance to help someone I'd once cared about, even if it was from afar. That night, I barely slept, my thoughts circling her. Thursday dragged on, and I couldn't shake Sophie from my mind. Every time I tried to focus on work, spreadsheets, emails, deadlines, her name would creep back in, pulling up memories I hadn't touched in years. I remembered her laugh, the way she'd tease me and Claire about our sibling bickering, or how she'd sit cross-legged on the couch, flipping through magazines with a kind of effortless grace. Back then, I was just a lanky kid, too shy to do anything but steal glances. Now, knowing what she'd been through, those memories felt heavier, laced with a sadness I couldn't ignore. By the time I wrapped up work that evening, I was restless. My apartment felt too quiet, too empty. I paced, replaying Claire's call. Helping Sophie move wasn't just about lifting boxes. It was about showing up for someone who'd been through hell. I didn't want to overthink it, but I couldn't help wondering what seeing her again would feel like. Would she even remember me the way I remembered her? I texted Claire that night. I'm in. I'll help Sophie tomorrow. She replied with a quick thank you and sent me the address. I tried to sleep, but my mind was a mess of anticipation and nerves. When Friday morning came, I was up early, showered, and out the door by 6:30. The drive to Sophie's new place was about 45 minutes, through a quiet suburb outside of Philly. I pulled up to a small apartment complex, nothing fancy but tidy, with neat lawns and a few trees starting to turn with the early fall. I parked and waited, sipping coffee from a thermos. Around 8 o'clock, a beat-up hatchback rolled in, stuffed to the brim with boxes and bags. Sophie stepped out and my breath caught. She looked different but the same. Her hair shorter, her face a little thinner, but still her. She wore jeans and a faded sweater, her movements quick but tired. When she spotted me, she froze, her eyes widening. "James? You've been waiting long?" she asked, her voice laced with guilt. I shrugged, playing it cool. "Not too long. Let's get to it." She apologized again, but I waved it off, grabbing a box from her back seat. We started unloading, working in a rhythm that felt oddly natural. The boxes weren't too heavy, mostly clothes, books, and kitchen stuff, all labeled in her neat handwriting. We didn't talk much at first, just small things, where to put this, how to stack that. Every now and then, she'd say something that made us both chuckle, like when she warned me not to drop a box marked fragile wine glasses because they were the only thing keeping her sane. I laughed, and for a moment, it felt like we were kids again, joking around at my parents' house. But there was a weight to her, a quietness in her eyes when she thought I wasn't looking. I didn't push her to talk. I just kept moving, carrying the heavier stuff while she organized. By late afternoon, we'd gotten most of her things inside. The apartment was small but cozy, with bare walls and a few pieces of mismatched furniture. I could tell she was trying to make it her own, but it still felt like a work in progress. As we set down the last box, she wiped her forehead and smiled. A real smile, not the polite one she'd been giving me all day. "You didn't have to do this, she said, leaning against the counter. "I mean, Claire probably twisted your arm." I shook my head, telling her it was no trouble. Then, before I could overthink it, I said I'd come back tomorrow with some tools to fix a wobbly shelf I'd noticed in her kitchen. Her face softened, and she nodded. "That'd be great, James." "Thank you." I left as the sun was setting, promising to be back early. Driving home, I couldn't stop thinking about her. She was still Sophie, beautiful, kind, sharp-witted, but there was a fragility to her now, like she was holding herself together by sheer will. I didn't want to assume anything, didn't want to read too much in her warmth. She was hurting, rebuilding. I told myself I was just helping, nothing more. But as I lay in bed that night, her smile kept creeping into my thoughts, and I wondered what tomorrow would bring. Saturday morning, I woke up earlier than I wanted, my mind already on Sophie. The thought of heading back to her place made my stomach twist, not in a bad way, but like I was stepping into something I couldn't quite predict. I grabbed my toolbox, threw on a clean shirt, and drove back to her apartment. The air was crisp, the kind of early fall morning that feels like it's holding its breath. When I knocked, Sophie opened the door with a smile that seemed brighter than the day before. She looked more at ease, her hair tied back loosely, wearing a soft gray sweatshirt and jeans. "You're early," she teased, stepping aside to let me in. I grinned, holding up the toolbox. "Didn't want to keep you waiting this time." I got to work on the kitchen shelf, tightening bolts and leveling it out. The task was simple, but the smell of something cooking started to fill the apartment, a rich, warm scent that made my mouth water. I glanced over and saw Sophie stirring a pot on the stove. "Chili," she said, catching my eye. "Figured I owe you more than just a thank you for yesterday." I laughed, brushing it off, but the truth was I couldn't remember the last time someone had cooked for me. My life had been a blur of takeout containers and protein bars since my breakup. The idea of a homemade meal felt almost foreign, like a memory from someone else's life. By the time I finished with the shelf, Sophie had set the table, 2 bowls, spoons, a plate of cornbread in the middle. It was simple but thoughtful, and I felt a warmth settle in my chest. We sat down, and the conversation flowed easily. We talked about old times, like when she and Claire used to sneak snacks from the kitchen during sleepovers, thinking I wouldn't notice. You were always lurking around, she said, her eyes sparkling with mischief. This quiet kid, always watching. I laughed, a little embarrassed, and admitted I wasn't as sneaky as I thought. You haven't changed much, she added, tilting her head. Still quiet, but stronger. You've grown into yourself. Her words caught me off guard, and I felt my face heat up. I managed to mumble something about her not changing either, and she smiled, her cheeks flushing just a touch. We kept talking, swapping stories about life since those days. She asked about my job, and I told her about the grind, long hours, out-of-town trips, the promotion I was chasing. She listened, really listened, nodding in a way that made me feel seen. I didn't ask about her marriage, didn't want to pry, but she brought it up herself, almost casually. It wasn't all bad at first, she said, staring at her bowl. But after the losses, he changed. Or maybe I did. Either way, we couldn't hold it together. Her voice was steady, but there was a rawness there, like a wound still healing. I didn't know what to say, so I just nodded, letting her know I was there. After we ate, Sophie stood and pulled a bottle of red wine from a box she hadn't unpacked yet. A little thank you bonus, she said, holding it up with a grin. I don't usually drink, never really got into it, but the moment felt too easy to break. I didn't want to seem ungrateful or kill the vibe, so I took the glass she offered. We moved to the couch, the wine loosening our words. She talked about the past year, how she felt stuck until she finally left her old place. This apartment, she said, glancing around, it's the first thing that's felt like mine in a long time. I told her I got it, that starting over was hard but worth it. She looked at me then, her eyes soft but searching. What about you, James? You seeing anyone? I chuckled, shaking my head. Nah, not really. Been too busy. She raised an eyebrow, teasing. What? Too busy breaking hearts. I laughed harder than I meant to, telling her I was definitely not that guy. She gave me a playful look like she wasn't entirely convinced, but her smile said she was joking. We kept talking, the conversation weaving between light and heavy. She mentioned Claire had once asked her some tough questions about her marriage. Not to judge, but to make her see what she was ignoring. Those questions stuck with me, Sophie said. Made me realize I was holding on to something that wasn't there anymore. The wine was hitting me more than I expected. I hadn't noticed how much I'd sipped while we talked, but my head felt light, my thoughts a little fuzzy. When I stood to leave, grabbing my keys, I realized my steps weren't as steady as they should have been. Sophie noticed too. You okay to drive? She asked, her brow furrowing. I brushed it off, but she wasn't having it. James, you're not driving like this, she said, her voice firm but kind. Just stay. Crash on the couch. I hesitated, not wanting to overstep. She must have seen it in my face because she added, I'm not asking for anything. I just don't want you to get hurt. Her concern was so genuine, so unguarded, that I couldn't argue. I nodded, telling myself I'd keep things simple, respectful. But as I settled onto the couch, my mind was already racing, wondering what this meant and what tomorrow would bring. I barely slept on Sophie's couch, not because it was uncomfortable, though it wasn't exactly a luxury bed, but because my mind wouldn't shut off. The faint hum of the refrigerator, the occasional creak of the apartment settling, and the lingering scent of chili in the air kept me tethered to the moment. I kept replaying the day, her smile, the ease of our conversation, the way her eyes softened when she talked about starting over. I told myself to keep it together, to not read too much in her kindness. She was fresh out of a divorce, carrying scars I could only imagine. The last thing she needed was me complicating things with feelings I wasn't even sure I should have. Still, lying there in the dark, I couldn't help but wonder what it would be like to see her again, not just to help with boxes or shelves, but to really know her now, as adults, as people who'd both been through our own battles. Around 2 a.m., I heard soft footsteps. Sophie appeared in the dim light of the hallway, her silhouette wrapped in a loose cardigan. Can't sleep? She asked, her voice low, almost a whisper. I sat up, rubbing my eyes, and admitted the couch was winning the battle against me. She laughed quietly, then hesitated before saying, The bed's more comfortable, you know. I don't bite. Her tone was light, but there was something earnest behind it, like she didn't want me to feel alone in that moment. I froze, my brain scrambling to process. I didn't want to misread her, didn't want to assume anything she wasn't offering. "I'm good here," I said, trying to sound casual, but my voice betrayed a crack of uncertainty. She looked at me for a long moment, her expression unreadable, then nodded. "Okay, James, but if you change your mind, the offer's open." She disappeared back down the hallway, leaving me with a racing heart and a head full of questions. By morning, I was up before the sun, folding the blanket she'd given me. The apartment was quiet, but the smell of coffee soon drifted in. Sophie was in the kitchen, already dressed, her hair pulled back in a messy bun. She handed me a mug, her fingers brushing mine for a split second, and I felt that same twist in my stomach from the day before. "You didn't have to get up so early," she said, sipping her own coffee. I shrugged, telling her I had a habit of waking up early for work. We stood there for a moment, the silence comfortable but heavy with something unspoken. Then she said, "Thanks for yesterday. Not just the shelves, but, being here." Her voice was soft, and when she looked at me, her eyes held a gratitude that made my chest ache. I nodded, not trusting myself to say more than, "Anytime." We sat at her small kitchen table, the morning light filtering through a window that overlooked the quiet street. The conversation started light, her plans to paint the apartment, my stories about ridiculous work deadlines. But it shifted when she brought up the past again. She said, stirring her coffee, "I always thought you were sweet back then. Quiet but sweet. I used to wonder what you were thinking, always watching from the sidelines." I laughed, caught off guard, and admitted I'd had a massive crush on her as a teenager. Her eyes widened, a playful smile tugging at her lips. "Really? You never said anything." I shrugged, feeling my face heat up. "You were older, cooler. I didn't think I had shot." She laughed, a real laugh that filled the room, and said, "You were cuter than you gave yourself credit for, James." That moment felt like a bridge between who we were and who we'd become. She leaned back, her expression softening. "I wish I'd paid more attention back then," she said, almost to herself. "Maybe things would have been different." I didn't know how to respond, so I just sipped my coffee, letting her words hang there. Then she asked, "What about now? You still think I'm out of your league?" It was half teasing, half serious, and I felt my pulse quicken. I managed a smile, saying, "You're still Sophie." That's enough to intimidate anyone. She laughed again, but her eyes lingered on mine, and for a second, I thought she might say something more. Instead, she stood, clearing the mugs. "I've got some errands to run today," she said, her tone shifting back to practical. "But maybe you could come by again? Help me hang some pictures or something." I nodded, too quickly, and said I'd be free next weekend. As I grabbed my toolbox and headed for the door, she stopped me, her hand lightly touching my arm. "James," she said, her voice steady but warm, "you don't know how much this means. Having someone here, someone who doesn't make me feel like I'm starting from nothing." I looked at her, saw the vulnerability in her eyes, and felt something shift inside me. I told her I was glad to help, that I'd see her soon. Driving home, my mind was a storm. I didn't know what this was, friendship, nostalgia, or something more, but I knew I wanted to find out. The question was whether Sophie felt the same, or if I was just a safe harbor in her storm. I didn't have answers, but the thought of seeing her again kept me tethered to a hope I hadn't felt in a long time. The week after that Saturday felt like it stretched forever. Work kept me busy. Meetings, reports, a last-minute trip to a client's site 2 hours away. But Sophie was a constant hum in the back of my mind. I'd catch myself thinking about her laugh, the way her eyes crinkled when she teased me, or the quiet vulnerability in her voice when she talked about her past. I tried to keep my expectations in check, reminding myself she was rebuilding her life, that her warmth didn't necessarily mean anything more than gratitude. But every time my phone buzzed, I hoped it was her. It wasn't. Not until Thursday, when she texted, "Still good for Saturday? Got some picture frames that need hanging." I smiled, typing back a quick "I'll be there." The simplicity of it felt like a lifeline, something to hold on to amidst the chaos of my thoughts. Saturday morning, I showed up at her apartment with my toolbox and a couple of picture hooks I'd picked up. Sophie greeted me at the door, her hair loose and her smile brighter than the last time. The apartment looked more lived in now. Plants on the windowsill, a rug in the living room, a few books stacked neatly on a shelf. "You're making it your own," I said, nodding at the changes. She grinned, proud but a little shy. "Trying to. It started to feel like home." We got to work, measuring walls and marking spots for the frames. She'd picked out photos, family, friends, a black and white shot of a city skyline I didn't recognize. As we hung them, she told me stories behind each one. A trip to Boston with her sister, a candid of her parents laughing, a sunset she'd captured on a rare solo hike. Her voice was lighter, like she was rediscovering pieces of herself. We took a break around noon, sitting on her couch with iced tea she'd made. The conversation drifted to our teenage years again, and she laughed, remembering how I'd always hover near her and Claire during their sleepovers. "I thought you were just being nosy," she said, nudging me with her elbow. I admitted, half embarrassed, that I was mostly just trying to be around her. Her smile softened as she looked at me in a way that made my chest tighten. "You're sweet, James. You always were." Then, almost like she caught herself, she stood to grab more picture hooks, changing the subject to where the next frame should go. By late afternoon, the walls looked complete, and we stepped back to admire our work. The apartment felt warmer, more hers. "You're hired," she joked, brushing a strand of hair from her face. I laughed, saying I'd send her an invoice. Then, out of nowhere, she said, "Stay for dinner? I'm making tacos. Nothing fancy, but I'd like the company." I didn't hesitate this time, nodding before I could overthink it. As she cooked, I sat at the counter, watching her move with an ease that hadn't been there last weekend. We talked about everything and nothing. Movies we loved, the worst jobs we'd ever had, how she was thinking about getting a cat. It felt so normal, so right, that I almost forgot the weight of her past or the questions in my head. After dinner, we ended up back on the couch, a single lamp casting a soft glow. She poured us both a glass of wine, and I took it, promising myself to go slow this time. The conversation turned deeper, almost without warning. She talked about her marriage, not the pain, but the small moments that had once made it good, like cooking together or driving nowhere just to talk. "I miss that," she said quietly, staring at her glass. Not him, but feeling like I belonged with someone. I didn't know what to say, so I just listened, letting her words settle. Then she looked at me, her eyes steady. "What about you, James? What do you want?" The question caught me off guard. I stumbled through an answer about work, stability, but it felt hollow. She tilted her head, like she could see through me. "That's not what I mean," she said softly. The air felt heavier now, charged with something I couldn't name. I set my glass down, trying to find the right words. "I don't know," I admitted. "I've been running from one thing to the next, trying not to think too hard about it." She nodded, like she understood, and for a moment, we just sat there, the silence saying more than we could. Then she leaned closer, her hand resting on mine. "You don't have to have it all figured out," she said. Her touch was warm, grounding, and before I could stop myself, I turned my hand to hold hers. She didn't pull away. Instead, she leaned in, and we kissed, slow, tentative, like we were both testing the waters. It wasn't rushed or desperate. It was real, and it scared me as much as it thrilled me. When we pulled back, her eyes searched mine, and I saw a mix of hope and fear that mirrored my own. "Is this okay?" she whispered. I nodded, my throat tight. "Yeah, is it okay with you?" She smiled, a small, shaky thing, and nodded back. We didn't say much after that. She curled into me, her head on my shoulder, and we sat there, the quiet wrapping around us like a blanket. I held her, careful not to push, not to assume. She fell asleep like that, her breathing steady against me, and I stayed awake, my mind racing. I didn't know what this meant for her, for me, for us. Was this a moment or something more? She was still healing, and I wasn't sure I was ready to open myself up again. But holding her, feeling her warmth, I knew I didn't want to let go. Not yet.